Hello and welcome to News Corp's Global Roundtable, a perspective on the UK and the United States elections of 2024. I'm Gerard Baker. I'm editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal. I'm in New York, and I'm really delighted today to be joined by some of News Corp's most esteemed commentators from around the world, giving us a global perspective on these big elections that are taking place this year. From London, I'm joined by Iain Martin, commentator, columnist for The Times. From here in the United States, Kim Strassel, of the who writes the Potomac Watch column for the Wall Street Journal and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal and commentator. And from Australia, where it's very early in the morning at this house, so thank you very much indeed, Greg, for getting up early. Greg Sheridan, foreign affairs editor, previously commentator of the Australian newspaper. So as I say, an experienced, knowledgeable, and I think we can say entertaining panel. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. We're going to do a couple of these. This first one is going to be focused on the UK elections. As you know, I'm sure many of you have been following it. Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, Conservative Prime Minister, unexpectedly called an election a few weeks ago, which will take place on July the 4th, in a few weeks from now. It's fair to say the polls are not very favourable for his Conservative Party, his ruling Conservative Party, suggesting that they are going to go down to a defeat, perhaps a defeat of historic proportions. So we're going to look at this, the election, what might happen, what's going to happen in the election, the results, what a new government might look like, and what it might mean for the future of the Conservative Party, and indeed globally for conservatism. So Iain Martin, I'm going to come to you straight away. First of all, you're there in the UK. You've been following this, and you've been following politics in the UK for a long time. We're in the middle of this election campaign. What's your sense of what's going to happen?
Well, it's looking, as it stands at the moment, with a little more than three weeks until polling day, as though it's going to be a spectacular disaster for the Conservatives. And it is, of course, the campaigns do change things sometimes. The campaign in 2017 election turned around with 3 weeks to go, so it can happen. But there's no sign of it yet at all. And if it happens as it appears it's going to, you're looking at a Labour landslide that could be not just a conventional style defeat, but a super majority for the Labour Party, maybe even a majority of 200 or 250 seats partly because of the peculiar way in which the UK voting system works and the way in which the votes are fragmenting. And essentially the Tories are being squeezed in three directions: by the Labour Party that has turned itself around, by Reform on the populist right, and by the Liberal Democrats who are squeezing them in a lot of their sort of traditional affluent areas. You add all that together in what's effectively a two-party system, where there are other smaller parties, and the Tories are polling in the low 20s. So the conditions are there for an absolute disaster for the British Conservatives.
Iain, less than 5 years ago, the Conservatives were elected with their biggest majority, a landslide of its own, their biggest majority in almost 40 years. Boris Johnson was the triumphant Prime Minister, huge majority, could look forward to a full term in office, and probably everybody thought back then yet more conservative victories at elections. What on earth went wrong? How do we get to this point where the Tories are not only going to lose, but as you say, are going to lose on some historic scale?
Well, it's quite, it's a really interesting question, because Boris Johnson had it all set up in front of him. He was the man who'd got Brexit done. And as you say, a majority of 80, I can remember when it was fashionable to say for a long time in Britain that the Conservatives would never have a majority ever again, or certainly not in my lifetime. And somehow he did it. He was almost an electoral magician. He was helped by the fact, of course, that the Labour Party went off in a crazy, very left-wing, sort of hard left direction, and a lot of people were worried about that. So he built an electoral coalition which did not survive the pandemic. I mean, lots of governments are losing in the aftermath of the pandemic, so that's a factor. But also the key condition was in 2019 was that the Tories were set fair for a decade, as long as Boris Johnson didn't screw it up. And astonishingly, for those of us who observed his career.
And what do you know?
I mean, if only there'd been some signs there in his previous career in the 25 years. But while he's a political magician, he's not a great administrator. He quickly became embroiled in scandal after the pandemic. But actually, that electoral coalition, which was blue collar, so you had blue collar traditional Labour voters who voted for him, who wanted Brexit to be done, but also mainstream traditional sort of country club in American terms, conservatives in the UK who were terrified of the far left. It added up together to an electoral coalition, which maybe it needed an extraordinary personality to hold it all together, and that was Boris Johnson. And the moment that he lost the trust of the voters, and the voters just decided that Boris had to go, it then spiraled off into a series of leadership contests. Liz Truss, who was only prime minister for 49 days, and then Rishi Sunak, who, I mean, he's made some mistakes, but he's also turned things around in administrative terms. He's restored some order, but that's not enough. And the electorate is furious, thinks that everything is getting worse. Shades of the US here. Cost of living crisis, the energy crisis, the war in Europe. You add all that together with the Labour Party simultaneously getting its act together and becoming incredibly disciplined and focused on winning at all costs, and you've got the makings of a disaster for the Tories.
I want to come back to the Labour Party and ask you that, but Kim Strassel, you're in the US. You focus primarily on US politics, but I know you follow British politics closely too, and particularly can offer a global perspective. As you watch this election, in fact, indeed, as you've watched the Tory government of the last few years, what have you seen? What are you seeing that may tell us something larger than simply the issues of what's going on in British politics, about conservatives, about the conservative movement, about the ideas and the kind of the battle that's raging actually inside the conservative movement all around the world, and not least obviously here in the United States?
Sure. When I step back and look at this, the Tories are a warning signal on what happens when populism goes wrong. We've been having a lot of discussion about populist movements across the globe. And I always use that term with a little bit of care, because there's a group out there that would always suggest that is a pejorative word, populism. But, it comes from the notion of the popular will of the people. And sometimes populist policies equal good politics, especially if they do not conflict with a party's central principles, or if they don't impede the economy, or if they fit in line with constitutional principles. One example of that, for instance, is the immigration debate that you're having at the moment. That's often referred to as a populist movement, embraced by far-right candidates. But in reality, if you look at it, for instance, in the United States, this issue of a maintained border security, rule of law, that's an 80-20 issue in this country. It cuts across party lines, etc. Where the Tories have gone wrong is adopting a lot of what I would say populist policies. They probably doubled down to a certain degree on what they saw happening with Donald Trump and his electoral victories. They took it to a different level. And you've had it, whether it be their climate agenda, which was meant to cater to that country club group that Iain was mentioning, or whether it's them chasing working class voters with handouts that they think will be good. Those are populist policies that are in complete conflict with what conservatives have always believed in: limited government, etc. They've been throwing in new regulations and higher taxes, and it conflicts with everything we know about what works well in terms of economic management. And now here they are. They've got inflation, higher costs of living. They've got green policies that there's a revolt against. We've seen across all of Europe. We saw that in the recent parliamentary elections. The Greens took an absolute thumping. We've been seeing European governments pull back from some of their more aggressive initiatives because it's been so hard on their economies. And so you see this revolt against them. And we always have a saying at the Wall Street Journal editorial page, good policy equals good politics. Bad policy also equals bad politics. And so here the Tories are.
Just let me stop you there, and I want to come to Greg, but I very quickly want to give Iain a chance to just respond to that. Iain, I mean, it does seem to me that a lot of what Kim says obviously makes sense, but it's also true that the Conservatives are, as you pointed out, face a real threat from populists themselves. The Conservative Party, in fact, the larger threat may be coming from populists led by Nigel Farage of UK Reform UK, who are not happy with Conservatives because they don't think they've been populist enough, whether it's on immigration, on a more, taking on the woke crowd and all this kind of stuff. So is there a problem in a way, as Kim says, that they've done some of this kind of sort of they've done some of this populism, but they haven't done it well enough, or is there a more fundamental problem the Conservatives face?
Well, simultaneously, that broad coalition that I talked about that Boris Johnson constructed, was flawed from the start, arguably, because Boris Johnson is one of the most liberal politicians on immigration that this country's ever seen. The rules that he set in place as Prime Minister resulted in last year record immigration. Numbers which were off the charts. Now, it was partly a post-COVID labour market, labour force readjustment. There are all sorts of factors, but he essentially reduced the rules, and you ended up with an enormous surge of migration, which has fueled Farage. But it's the difficulty the Tories are going to have afterwards and reform is how do you make a movement out of this, where people believe fundamentally different things. Nigel Farage is a real, free trader, ironically quite different from Trump in some ways, but a free trading Thatcherite. In one respect, but also very tough on migration. But his voters aren't that. They're blue collar. They're not Thatcherites. They're for higher spending. They're for higher welfare. Actually, if you dig into the numbers, so it's really an incoherent howl of rage. I'm not knocking those voters. I understand the anger post financial crisis, but when you get to actual practical solutions, it doesn't hang together.
There's a very important lesson there. Greg Sheridan, I want to bring you in. You're not an election isn't, as I understand it, scheduled for this year in Australia, although you could have one, but certainly within the next year or so. So you're coming for election. You've got a Labour government, which looks like it's increasingly under pressure in the polls. And I'm struck when I look at Australian politics, Greg, many of the same issues that are a concern for UK and US voters: immigration, obviously inflation, energy, and the green agenda. As you look at the UK election, Greg, what lessons are you drawing there, possibly for Australia and indeed for the wider, especially again for the conservatives around the world?
Well, Gerard, US, Australian and UK politics do seem to echo each other a good deal, and they share a lot of personnel. But I think from Asia's point of view, this British election just demonstrates what Asia has come to consider now as a settled conclusion, which is Western countries can't govern themselves any longer. Once democracy was seen as an element of modernisation and enjoyed a lot of prestige even in Southeast Asia. Now you go all around Asia and they say, well, we're not sorry that our leaders are not Trump and Biden, and look at the astonishing mess Johnson has made of Britain. And even in Australia, with all your endowments of mineral wealth, you're messing things up. It seems to me there's both a crisis for the Conservatives and a crisis in Western governance. All Western nations are in the same circumstance. They can't control transfer payments. People have lost faith in the political process to settle disputes and come to an agreed conclusion and then allow the government to implement its program and judge it at the next election. Henry Kissinger observed that no Western government can any longer ask for any sacrifice from its people. So in our election, we had what you're having in the British election and what we'll get in the American election, which is completely unrealistic promises from the political leaders. They all say we're going to increase your benefits left and right. They all say we live in the most dangerous strategic circumstances we've confronted since World War II, but they don't make any significant effort on defence to increase defence, partly because they're all in massive budget deficit because they can't control transfer payments. Now, the prospect of a Margaret Thatcher coming into that circumstance and saying, guess what, we've got to cut government spending, which means cutting social services. Western governments seem to have grown bigger than ever and at the same time more impotent than ever. And the electorates are very cynical with them. And the only thing the electorate will accept from a government now is a fistful of cash. That makes it very hard to use politics to resolve policy questions in the way that we could up until a generation ago.
fascinating what you said about Asian observations about the British election, the US election, indeed Europe for that matter. And yeah, of course, Asia itself isn't exactly. 5 or 10 years ago, you could look at Asia, and Asia did see. Everybody talked about the Asian century, the Chinese century. A lot of doubts now, obviously, about China. China's economy's run into some significant problems. Japan continues to have long-term problems. The issues of within Asia of diplomacy and trade and economics are becoming more and more complex. But do you think there is a sense? Is there still that sense in Asia that we are just witnessing the sort of rapid decline of the West, and that they really are still in the ascendant?
So the only thing that Southeast Asians in particular are dogmatic about is their pragmatism and lack of dogmatism. Now, they don't have any of the hesitations that Western liberals have about Western governments. I mean, imagine going to Bangkok and telling them that a head of government has mistresses and makes money from real estate. Good heavens, Louis, gambling in a casino. I can't believe it. So they're absolutely relaxed about all that, couldn't care less, have not the slightest interest in Western identity debates, or, couldn't care less whether we have full paid maternity leave, or think our gender policies are just insane but aren't fussed about them one way or another. But whereas when I started in journalism 45 years ago, Southeast Asians in ASEAN would say, one day we want to be like the European Union. No one in Asia any longer says, we want to emulate, gosh, if only we were governed as well as those British. Thank goodness. And of course, almost all Asians value stability. Now, everything you say about their own problems is absolutely right, and no one is more alive to those problems than they are. But the prestige of democracy has declined in the global south, and certainly in Asia, because America, Britain, and Australia have had such obviously dysfunctional governments. And of course, Asia is completely hypocritical about climate change. Most Asian nations are not going to bankrupt themselves to go down the climate road, and they just watch Britain bankrupting itself and Australia bankrupting itself with the green policies, and they think these folks are crazy. And the last thing they want to do anymore is be like us.
Let me pick up on that, Iain. Come back to you and talk. Greg makes a very good point there about kind of like what we become obsessed with, the debate about what kind of values, what kind of society we're creating here, especially on a lot of these issues of gender and identity and all of that stuff, have no resonance whatsoever in most of Asia. Let's talk. That leads us on neatly, I think, to talking about the kind of government Britain is going to have after July the 5th. Labour, as we all understand, Labour is going to win a majority somewhere between huge and gargantuan, led by Keir Starmer, who I think it's fair to say not many people around the world are particularly familiar with. Tell us, Iain, what sort of a government Britain is going to have after July the 5th, and where it's going to take the country.
Well, it's going to be, for a start, I mean, there's going to be so much competitive wokery. This is going to be the woke Olympics. I mean, a feature of this government will be that it won't have much room for manoeuvre in fiscal terms. I mean, it's going to be boxed in by the markets. Therefore, he's going to need things to do which will please the left. Now, he'll begin by saying no one's interested in this woke agenda. I'm concentrating on the people's real priorities. But throughout the public sector in the UK, where that's very strong, and in corporates as well, increasingly, which are captured, the message will go out that Conservatives are smashed and fighting with each other, and into that vacuum can pour progressive analysis. And so I just think you'll get more and more of that. That might end up annoying voters. On the spending side, as I say, he's reined in. Where I think it's going to get most interesting, I mean, Jerry, that how obsessed I am on the defense, security, technology side. That is where it very quickly gets interesting, because he will run straight smack bang into foreign affairs, the likelihood of a Trump presidency, and some big decisions to take about where Britain sits in the world. Now, we're having this conversation with the US, Australia, the UK. I mean, it's almost an AUKUS conversation. And I think of AUKUS as actually the most significant thing which has happened in politics in the UK, and arguably more broadly in the last decade or so. And what it is essentially a defense technology sharing agreement, which is the beginnings of a different regulatory space. And we're thinking about the world into which Australia, the UK, the US, Canada, when they join, and Japan join, and then South Korea will want to join. So you can actually, to that Asian point about the sort of contempt or dismissiveness of the US and a country like the UK, I can understand that on the EU. I think if you take a sort of 10, 20, 30 year view of it, actually, I think that there's a chance that the democracies, or our democracies, there are some signs that we're starting to get organized around that AI and technology piece. And Starmer will have to decide quickly whether or not he wants to be regulated on AI and tech by Brussels. Does he align with Brussels in this attempt because they want to be friendlier to Europe? And I think that's a catastrophic mistake if they do that. I would bet on the partnership with the Anglosphere and with the US in particular.
Kim, I've had conversations with senior British Labour officials who will be senior government ministers in a few weeks' time. They very much look to the US. They look to Joe Biden. They really admire. I know you and I. It may bring a wry smile to our faces, but they're really after the green agenda, the infrastructure, the support for domestic industry, all of the things that sort of Biden's quote unquote achievements here in the United States. And it does seem to be very much. It seems to be a model for the left. I mean, of course, I wonder what you make of that, and whether you, as you look to the outcome of this election, whether you sort of Bidenomics is going to spread around the world. But also, of course, I mean, how short-lived could it be if Donald Trump's president in 6 months' time?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you could look at that as a model of success. And you can look at Joe Biden's approval ratings in this country, which are largely rooted in the continued high inflation that we've seen from blowout spending, from the piling on of a regulatory agenda that has made things even harder for corporations and business, including small business owners, and also the threat that's now hanging over the U.S. That we will see a return to some of those very high corporate tax rates that were rolled back as part of the Trump tax cuts. So it certainly has not been a model for success, other than the fact that Joe Biden, and people forget this, managed to very, very narrowly win election in the middle of a pandemic rush and after some grave mistakes regarding that pandemic by Donald Trump, who was also a very controversial character. As you note, right now, he looks as though he will re-win the office. And I still think that that is highly likely. And it says something that he can be so controversial and recently convicted in a court of law. That is a comment on the rejection of Biden policies in this country. I think the more interesting thing in my mind is, as Tories look at what is happening, and when they get routed, as Iain says they're going to, what is the reckoning going to be? And similarly, what is going to happen in the Republican Party, whether Trump wins because he's only in for 4 years, or whether he loses. I think both of those parties, and Australia as well, too, there's going to have to be some very hard choices about whether or not they return to some of the Thatcherism that is, and Reaganism that was great economics and good for the economy, or whether or not they further double down on a lot of these policies that make them somewhat indistinguishable from center-left candidates.
Greg, I don't imagine Sir Keir Starmer, to give him his full name, Sir Keir Starmer is much of a household name in either in Australia or in much of Asia, although somebody did once tell me that Sir Keir, apparently, which is because he's got a knighthood in the UK, Sir Keir is a very rude word in Farsi, in Persian. So maybe that will become maybe a diplomatic incident in the course of the next year or two. But as you look at a new Labour government in the UK, and particularly from a foreign policy perspective, Iain's already mentioned the AUKUS deal, which of course was signed by a Conservative government. What do you think Britain under a new Labour government might have to offer, whether it's with regard to Europe, but obviously more importantly in the longer terms in terms of the relationships with Asia?
Well, Jerry, Britain has been a pretty good story in Australia and Asia the last few years. I mean, Johnson was an absolutely compelling personality, certainly the funniest, wittiest person I've met inside or outside of politics. And of course, Indians are quite proud of Rishi Sunak. And, when I went to interview him, I played up my Punjabi wife and, he's a very charming guy and all that. So Britain has been quite an interesting story. Also, Asia has not really bought onto the idea of inevitable American decline. They're just seeing that US, British and Australian governments are a complete hopeless mess at the moment, but they profoundly respect American power. And Britain still has a big presence in the psyche of Asia, from Premier League football and all the rest. But I guess where the rubber hits the road with the Starmer Labor government, is it really going to commit to AUKUS? So Asia takes AUKUS seriously, but at this stage, AUKUS functions as the symbolism of the alliance. So far, you'd have to say, looking at AUKUS, where's the beef, Jack? Now, are the United States really going to sell Virginia submarines to Australia? That'll mean they take them out of their order of battle. Britain has had a lot of trouble building nuclear submarines, a lot of trouble. Can it really build the new generation? And can it help us build them in Australia? Now, there's very well-placed scepticism about that. At the same time, the Chinese are running a very active diplomatic campaign against it. So the question for the Keir Starmer Labor government is it really committed to AUKUS? Keir Starmer is a lot like Anthony Albanese. He will be at the top of a party which is way, way, way to the left of him and way, way, way to the left of the electorate. Will the British Labor Party maintain support for AUKUS? Will it maintain support for the British nuclear deterrent, much less helping Australia build nuclear-powered submarines? Will it maintain the foot forward into Asia, which came about under Johnson, where it was sending aircraft carriers and also submarines and so forth to visit the Indo-Pacific? No one expects Britain to be a premier military power in the Indo-Pacific, but we're very keen to get it involved in the South Pacific. It is involved with us in the five-power defence arrangements with Malaysia and Singapore, and it is a very important part of the geostrategic effort to constrain China. Now, is Keir Starmer leading, as Iain points out, a very, very woke Labor Party, very keen on Palestine and all the rest of it? Is he going to be able to maintain that centrism, or will the party drive him further to the left?
I mean, I think he has. He's given pretty solid assurances on the first part of AUKUS. I mean, you're absolutely right, Greg. We don't know very much about his worldview. He said almost nothing about the world, about the transatlantic relationship. He's given one speech on Gaza. He's said very little on defence and security. But I think, and you're right also about the difficulties with the submarine program, but the potential economic opportunity where the industries of the future are going to be constructed is in Pillar 2, the tech sharing stuff, which is to come. Now that I would say the analogy is really with what the US did with the Manhattan Project through to DARPA. That is where, that from the 40s, 50s, 60s, that's where the economy of the 80s and 90s and beyond was invented, and the technology was invented, and it became dual use and then civilian use. Something similar is beginning to happen, driven by America's incredible capacity for innovation and the way in which it's winning, or is determined to win, the AI race with China, and let's hope it does win. And so if you're British, then the question is, do you want to be part of that, or do you want to go back in with Brussels and be regulated to death like it's been done with financial services and technology so far?
Iain, just very quickly chip in. The others should chip in too on this if they want to. But we haven't talked. Ukraine is obviously very much on everybody's mind. I know you've focused a lot on this. The Tories have been very, very solid on Ukraine under both Johnson. Liz Truss was the blink of an eye, but also under Sunak. Is Labour going to be as committed to continue to support Ukraine? And then Kim and Greg can also weigh in on this. Kim, particularly from the US perspective, especially with the prospect of a Donald Trump presidency, we don't even know what kind of the West's, NATO's Ukraine policy will really be. But just, Iain, quickly from you on, you think will Labour keep up that approach?
Yes, it will be. And their shadow defence guy, who almost certainly be defence secretary, has been very committed on it. The problem that Labour will have is that it will look to Paris and to Berlin, and obviously the relationship between those two countries is dreadful at the moment between those two capitals. Simultaneously, French politics is kind of coming apart. So they'll try and have a go at being the country, making Britain the country that sort of solves that problem, which I think is not possible to solve. So fairly quickly, I think Labour will be, confronted with the reality that it's about American power. What happens if a Trump administration backs away from Ukraine in some ways, a whole other question. That's Europe.
Well, so we got a whole other episode coming up on the US election, and Kim will weigh in a lot on that. I know, but just very briefly, Kim, on that. I mean, tell us what your assessment. You talk to Republicans a lot. I mean, will another a Trump administration, and maybe a Republican-controlled Congress, is that going to be it for Ukraine support?
Well, I'm actually very worried about the UK and its continued support, because we don't know much about Keir Starmer, as Iain was saying, and his worldview. And I do feel that there's an element in Britain that has a similar dynamic to the US. I mean, the American Democratic Party has never been one that was at the forefront of intervention in foreign conflicts. In fact, they were the opposite. They have rallied behind Joe Biden in part because it's a contrast with Donald Trump, and because Joe Biden has felt that he needed to be a strong figurehead in all of this. Does that come apart if Donald Trump wins the election? He's been very vague in his own way. I mean, mostly he walks around and says, if I'd been president, none of this would have happened. And when I'm president, we'll solve it in a day. Well, that's a lovely sentiment, but how do you actually do that? And there is, I think, some real concern that, especially dealing with budgetary pressures in the United States, in addition to Donald Trump's worldview, that there is going to be a fallback and support for Ukraine. And I worry very much that without that, and especially with Europe and Germany suffering both of their own internal political problems, that the UK will be left a little twisting in the wind, and the compulsion might be to also step away.
And Greg, if I may, very briefly on this, because we are almost out of time, but we often hear the focus on Ukraine is very much a northern and western hemisphere obsession, and that the southern hemisphere, thinks rather differently. Again, whether it's the outcome of the UK election or the outcome of the US election, I mean, how much does what happened in Ukraine? How much does that resonate in the rest of the world?
So, Jerry, a huge question, but I'll just make two quick points. The first is we're fully on board with the UK and the US on Ukraine, but we don't give them anything very much that's useful, and we don't spend a lot of money. And so, like everything else, and with like all other Western governments, we want to do it on the cheap, and therefore we're not doing it very well. But we haven't done very well with the Global South. We haven't convinced the Global South to support us in a significant way on Ukraine. And the second point I'd make is that Keir Starmer, like Anthony Albanese in Australia, will have enormous difficulties with the Trump administration. In the previous Trump administration, we had Conservative Prime Ministers, Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison. And with Shinzo Abe and Benjamin Netanyahu, they were very, very good Trump whisperers. We got great results out of the Trump administration. Bilaterally, he was fine for us. He caused a lot of chaos elsewhere, but he did everything for us that we wanted him to do, and they were very dedicated Trump whisperers. Now, I just think it's much harder for a Labor leader with a party which will viscerally hate Trump to engage in the kind of, Shinzo Abe would manage to 5-putt from 3 feet out to make sure Trump won the golf round. It's just much harder for Labor leaders to do that, and Trump is going to be a big challenge for Keir Starmer if he should win, just as he will be a very big challenge for Anthony Albanese. And the anti-American elements of the British Labor Party and the Australian Labor Party will be very hard for moderate prime ministers to control, I should think.
Very good point. We're pretty well out of time, but I just want one quick round from each of you, brief questions, brief answers, if you would. Everybody has been talking about this year as a year of elections everywhere. Almost half the world, citizens of the world, population of the world, is voting this year. We've got this big election in the UK coming up, the big election later in the US. Leaders like to talk about what's at stake in these elections, and particularly over here in the US, we hear a lot about democracy being at stake. I always think democracy somehow is always at stake when the left elites lose. Apparently, when they win, apparently democracy is just fine. But Iain, from the UK perspective, as you look at these elections, I mean, how healthy does democracy look, and do these elections offer an opportunity to strengthen it?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean,
it's 10 seconds if you would. No, I'm kidding. No, I'm kidding. I'll give you a little bit longer, but briefly, if you would.
I think we're in serious trouble if, by quirk of the system, you end up with almost no opposition, and you end up in a situation where you have a Labour government which has a massive majority, a super majority, because of a split on the right. And I just think that's going to be very unhealthy. I mean, history shows us that governments that have those supermajorities become arrogant and succumb to hubris and make terrible mistakes. And I think we're about to repeat that historical experience.
Kim, democracy on the ballot?
Everyone's talking about, oh, this is such an important and such serious elections. I have the opposite view. I think that this is going to be a round of not serious elections because of the dynamics of what's going on. As Iain was just saying, you have a Tory party that has so messed it up, and now you've got divisions among the right that is going to hand the Labour Party a victory, but for how long and what comes after. And similarly, Donald Trump, if he comes back to office, right now the United States is facing two candidates that most of the electorate do not want to have at the head of their party. And if Donald Trump should win, it's only 4 more years. If Joe Biden wins, it's only 4 more years. If he makes it those 4 years. And I still think that what's going to matter in elections are the next round and after some parties have had a shakeout and decided what they're actually going to be.
Greg, the plight of democracy, last word is on you.
Yeah, so in Britain, I think if Starmer wins very big, there'll be the problem of a lack of an opposition. But also, I think very quickly you'll get massive divisions within the Labour Party. The Labour Party itself is profoundly divided between social democrats and radicalised identity politics people and Palestinian activists and woke maniacs. And in the United States, I think Trump and Biden, neither of them is a bargain. I'd like to buy them at my estimate and sell them at their estimate. But what worries me more than those two individuals is this polarization of the legal system. So I do think the Trump trial in New York was a shocking abuse of process. And you're getting now Republican courts and Democrat courts, and the other half of the society won't accept the legitimacy of the courts. Now, that, oddly enough, that I think of everything that's happened in the United States in the last 5 or 6 years, that worries me more than anything else, and that takes the loss of trust in institutions to a whole new level.
Well, I wish we could talk more. We will have another opportunity to talk about the US election. We've touched on it a bit in this one, but for this one was focused on the British general election, which is on July the 4th, just a few weeks from now. And for all the talk and all the forecasts and all the expectations, and everybody knows what's going to happen, and the pundits always think they know the exact result, I always remember that there is always an element of uncertainty. In these circumstances, I always like to quote one of my favourite poems by G.K. Chesterton about the British people, which ends with the line, "Smile at us, payers, passers, but do not quite forget, for we are the people of England, and we have not spoken yet." Well, they get that chance on July the 4th. But in the meantime, Iain Martin, thank you so much from the Times, Kim Strassel, the Wall Street Journal, Greg Sheridan, the Australian. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us.